I just want to, because you make this point in your books repeatedly, John, that 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 neoliberalism never
Well,
made any economic sense, that it was an ideology that justified essentially the consolidation of wealth and power by the ruling oligarchy, but was, in terms of economic theory, was perpetuated by complete outliers. Ayn Rand and Hayek, and but it wasn't
I don't even think I'd
economically
use the
rational.
word rational, but it wasn't economics. Just wasn't economics. It was very, very, I mean, Hayek and Ayn Rand are second marginal, almost third rate, second rate people. They're not very intelligent. They're not saying anything very interesting. It's filled with contradictions. It's not sound economics in any way, shape, or form. And it was really about a shifting of power, and it was shifting of power towards a class system and away from the idea of citizenship and inclusion. And I actually would say that I never use the terms neoliberalism or neoconservatism, because those are classic high theft. These movements have nothing to do with liberalism and nothing to do with conservatism. This isn't what conservatism stood for. These are not Whigs. These are not Whigs. They don't stand for what Whigs stood for, and they certainly don't stand for what liberals stood for. This is self-interested, narrow ideology, which has nothing to do with sensible economics. And you'll note that the people who were the absolute lovers of this whole ideology, which they call neoliberalism or neoconservatism, haven't said a word through this crisis, because they wanted governmental money to be spent to save their bacon. So we've been through a half a century of, oh no, don't spend money, and then suddenly spend money,
Right.
and I do want to. So there was two things. One was the thing about working class, lower middle class, but the other thing which we should talk about is attitudes towards debt, which is what we're heading into right now. So I mean, if I can just say, yes, the system that was set up at the international level was to break the backs of what you might call respectable life for individual citizens by removing the control of regional and national and even multinational governments, two or three governments, on things like work standards, employment standards, and so on. It was part of the move massively towards lower standards, and it was done by breaking the power of the national and regional governments. It was very conscious. It was very intentional. Break the tax system, break the protection of the citizens system. And it wasn't just the working class, it was the lower middle class and a large part of the middle class. But I think that, and you haven't asked about it, but I mean, I do think we're now at this stage in this crisis where so many people said, well, we have to do it differently when we come out of this. And what you're seeing that in the rush to open up again, part of that rush is to make sure that we go back to the way it was done before. If you can do it, if you can open it up fast enough, there's no time for change. There's no time for consideration of how we would do things differently. And it is this, we failed miserably in 2008-9 to get the changes which were required, considering the failure of the ideology in place. And the question is, are we going to fail a second time? For me, 2008 and COVID are one and the same battle. They just happen to come from different sources.
You, in your book, quote Gramsci, the interregnum, and at one point you write how, in essence, the credibility of the ruling ideology has collapsed. Each of globalization's strengths has somehow turned out to have an opposing meaning. The lowering of national residency requirements for corporations has morphed into a tool for massive tax evasion. The idea of a global economic system mysteriously made local poverty seem unreal, even normal. The decline of the middle class, the very basis of democracy, seemed to be just one of those things that happen, unfortunate but inevitable, that the working class and lower middle class, even parts of the middle class, could only survive with more than one job per person seemed to be the expected punishment for not keeping up. The contrast between unprecedented bonuses for mere managers at the top and the four job families below that seemed inevitable in a globalized world. For 2 decades, an elite consensus insisted that unsustainable third world debts could not be put aside in a sort of bad debt reserve without betraying globalism's essential principles and moral obligations, which included unwavering respect for the sanctity of international contracts. It took the same people about 2 weeks to abandon sanctity and propose bad debt banks for their own far larger debts in 2009. Are we seeing, and I think we are, on both ends of the political spectrum, this loss of credibility in terms of the ideology that's been shoved down our throats in economic departments and by pundits on television? And what will that mean? What are the consequences of
Well,
that?
I mean, the very practical consequence is that if they're allowed to do what they want and they can get governments, if they can get 10, 15 governments to go along with them, particularly in the West, I would include Japan and Australia and so on, and that would be to convert the money printed over the last couple of months into the weight of debt, then they will have succeeded in a massive way in holding on to power, even though it will be catastrophic for them and everyone else. And this is one of those very, very important moments in history, the Solon moments, the Henry IV moments, when you actually have to say, this is not real debt. I mean, first of all, this is not an economic crisis. This is a health crisis, right? There were enormous problems with the economy, but that's not what caused the printing of the money. We are not in an inflationary period. There is no excuse for austerity. There's only one excuse for austerity, and that is runaway inflation's 1920s style in Germany. That's the only excuse there is for austerity. There is no other. When all the horses are out of the barn and you just have to do something radical, we're not in that situation at all. We're in a deflationary period. And so the most important thing that can be done now, and I can only say this in what will sound really irresponsible, but it isn't. It's deeply responsible, which is I would call for a meeting of, as quite soon, of probably not invite the government of the United States, of as many developed economy countries as possible, hold it at Versailles or someplace, you know, and they would agree that the money they have printed is extremely serious and will be paid back in about 200 years. And everybody will write on beautiful pieces of paper, and they'll get lovely people with wonderful handwriting to write out their moral and ethical obligation to pay back this money on these beautiful pieces of paper, and it will be signed by the right authorities, and they'll all be put together, and they'll be put in the most beautiful Louis XIV desk and a drawer, and it will be locked, and the key will be thrown away. I mean, I'm joking, but I'm not joking. This is what needs to happen. They just need to find a way to say, this is not debt. The worst thing you could do is to allow governments and state banks to convert that debt into the formality of public bonds that start being traded in the marketplace and create a complex mess. The sooner we actually say, we don't owe this. This is not something owed by our children and grandchildren. All that nonsense. We have to walk away from all of that. And if we walk away from all of that, I think you'll find it will be extremely easy to relaunch an economy. But what will be important is not simply to relaunch the economy, but to rethink some basics about how we relaunch them. If you want, we can talk a bit about that. But
we have to end there. But I think the consequences of not doing that, and we're already seeing it, are social unrest. In the United States, we have rent strikes. People are not paying their mortgages. This is just going to cascade. They can't pay their car loans, student debt, household debt, and with all of the economic catastrophes that will engender. And this is once again because of service towards an elite.
If this is
rather than towards
converted
citizens.
into expanding, inflating the role of the speculative group in society, then we are in the United States in particular, are in a decline from which I think it will be very hard to recover.
Great, thank you. That was author and intellectual John Ralston Saul speaking to us from his home in Toronto.
Thank you.
Thanks, John.